Welcome back, everybody, to the 360 Size Up podcast. We've got some awesome guests from the fire service on today, but we really got a hot topic that we want to talk about. We want to discuss that's going to affect the whole fire service, and that's the new proposed changes to OSHA's 1910-156. Both of my guests today are very knowledgeable about the changes. They're providing comments back through the IAFC. Josh Culp is with he is an industrial fire department. And then we also have Chief, I don't want to butcher your name, but you're on the municipal side, but you've definitely got skin in the game. And you're probably the one on this group that's probably got the most knowledge of the new changes. So I'm just going to turn it over to you and let you introduce yourself, and then we'll go to Josh.
Well, Dan, thanks so much for making time and space for this topic. It really is a hot topic going on in the fire service and worthy of a lot of discussion. I think that's what we're really looking for. And I think, honestly, that's what OSHA is looking for as well. For everyone that doesn't know, my name is Matt Tobia. I'm currently the fire chief in the city of Harrisonburg, Virginia. Fire department, small municipal department in the central Shenandoah Valley. I'm currently in my 36th year in emergency services. I started out as a volunteer in Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. Spent 23 years working in Anne Arundel County, Maryland, a metro department outside of Baltimore, Maryland, before retiring from there so that I could go to work with the great folks over in Loudoun County, Virginia, and spent 4 years working in that very large metropolitan combination fire rescue system, and then finally landing here in the central Shenandoah Valley, and just so honored to be involved. I've been involved mainly on the safety, health, and survival side of fire and emergency services. I'm the former chair of the safety, health, and survival section for the IAFC, which is how I came to be nominated to represent the IAFC on the work group that was formed in 2015 to begin the process of drafting new regulations to improve safety for emergency responders. So really looking forward to being part of this discussion tonight and the effort to improve firefighter safety throughout our community.
Thank you, Chief. Josh?
Yep, good evening, and thanks, Dan, for the opportunity. So my name is Josh Culp. I don't quite have as many years experience as Chief Tobia, but got my start at a volunteer department in Northern Virginia in Prince William County called OWL, and was with them for 17 years. And now I'm actively running actually just north of Chief Tobia in the Shenandoah Valley as a volunteer. So it totals a little over 20 years. Municipal as a volunteer, and then professionally I am with Micron Technology, headquartered in Idaho, but our closest site to me is in Manassas, Virginia, and we've got a few U.S. locations. One's coming soon in New York, and we have global presence. And my interest to this is, of course, what we need to do at our facilities to adapt to the changes to this, help our teams that we have there be prepared to comply with the law that's coming, and potentially use it as a benchmark maybe within our company for the facilities outside of the U.S. And I don't think I mentioned I've been with them for 19 years now, all in the emergency response capacity. So thanks.
Josh, you also sit on the Industrial Fire and Safety section board, so that you're providing comments back and be on the subcommittee also.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I've been with Dan on the IAFC committee for a few years now. It's been so much fun, I've lost track. But and then I'd be remiss if I didn't mention my other association I'm with, which is the Semiconductor Environmental Safety and Health Association, also called SESHA, and trying to just bring a network together there as well on the industrial side to help with this. So. Thank you.
I appreciate you being on here, Josh. So really what I want to accomplish this today on this podcast is just kind of give our guests just an overview of where the standard is today, the current standard, and really we don't have to pull everything out of the standard, the new proposed, but some of the big ones, because mean, this is a big change to where we're at today, to where we're going. And and I think, Chief, like I said, you've been doing this since 2015. Me and Josh have, through the IFC, we are giving comments, and we'll be on the subcommittee also giving comments back. But, can you give us just a little bit of what the IFC is doing, what our part is, where we're coming together to provide OSHA our comments and feedback?
Yeah, 100%. And thanks again. I do want to provide just a little bit of a context. And I think really the first most important thing is for everyone to realize very quickly that what is proposed today is probably a minimum of 2 years away from final rulemaking. So there's going to be ample opportunity, not only for feedback and input, but there's likely to be some substantive changes that may come before the final rules are published. And then the second really important thing to know is that OSHA is very interested in hearing about the possibility of a tiered implementation timetable, even after final rules are created. So I know that there's a lot of emotion right now around the possibility that OSHA could adopt final rules and that would create a tidal wave of change. I think the important thing to know right up front is that we are, in best case scenario, probably 2 years away from any final rule that may come related to 1910-156. So let's just talk a little bit about history for a minute. In the aftermath of 9/11, several presidential directives were put forward, one of which, of course, charged all federal agencies to look at ways to improve emergency responder safety. The ground zero was, by definition, the most toxic work site in American history. And one of the things that really came out of that was just an observable lack of measurable safety policies, procedures, and standards to ensure emergency responder safety. That began a directive to create a review at all levels of the federal government, all agencies, to start looking at how could individual agencies start to improve emergency responder safety. Well, if you go to OSHA, there is literally one regulation that is on point for the fire service, and it is the 1980 created 1910-156 standard, which only addressed industrial fire brigades. Although there are other tangential regulations out there, 1910-134, 1910-120, two of the most prominent ones, none of them are directly on point for emergency services personnel. And so when OSHA began to look at how they could improve emergency responder safety, they recognized that it was going to take an extraordinarily comprehensive effort. And so for only the second time in the history of OSHA, the NACOSH, which is the National Advisory Council on Occupational Safety and Health, directed through the Secretary of Labor the creation of a work group under the direction of NACOSH to create draft regulatory standards to address emergency responder safety. And that was the group that I was honored to be a part of. And I want to be clear about the fact that all of the national stakeholder entities that have a major national voice in fire and emergency services were at the table. This was not a work group of NACOSH personnel. It was a work group that was led by two members of NACOSH. However, it included the IAFC, the IAFF, the NVFC, the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation, NIOSH, CDC, a host of other agencies as well, and interested parties were invited to participate in the draft rulemaking effort. That draft rulemaking effort went on for about 15 months. Out of that came a set of proposed regulations. Those regulations were referred back to NACOSH. NACOSH unanimously voted to refer them to the Secretary of Labor with a recommendation for rulemaking. You'll recall that in November of 2016, there was a federal election that resulted in these draft regulations being placed on hold because all new federal regulations for a 4-year period were essentially placed on hold. When we had another national election in 2020, that resulted in new direction to the Secretary of Labor to reinvigorate this effort at rulemaking. And so the draft rules were pulled out. They were revised extensively by OSHA staff, and they were then proposed in February of 24 of this year. You saw that in the Federal Register, they were published as draft proposed rules. And again, these are very substantial, changes to the 1910-156. So it's really worth us spending some time talking about it. But I wanted to provide a little history of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, sounds like there's a whole lot of work going on behind the scenes to where we got today. So what you're saying is line of duty deaths was really and injuries was really that's where you started, and you're working your way down.
That's exactly right. OSHA really looked at, and if you look at the narrative in the Federal Register, it talks a lot about identifying preventable line of duty deaths and workplace injuries, which is, of course, OSHA's primary charge, and designed to have, that positive impact on ensuring workplace safety for emergency responders. It's important also to realize that regulations have very specific meanings in very specific areas. And it is also very important to recognize and know how OSHA regulations apply to you. For example, in many states, in states that do not have a state plan, Pennsylvania is an example of that. They do not have their own state plan. As a result, OSHA regulations do not apply to public service entities. So firefighters, career or volunteer in Pennsylvania, won't be impacted by these regulations. In Washington state, by contrast, which is a state plan state and does include volunteer firefighters in their definition, both public and private sector employers are impacted and will be potentially impacted by these regulations. But the bottom line is OSHA's main goal is to reduce preventable line of duty deaths and injuries.
So all these groups that come together that put the proposal together, were those face-to-face meetings or at any time, or
they were actually all face-to-face meetings? So representatives traveled to Washington, D.C., met at the Department of Labor, and were given very specific charges, very formal charges actually by OSHA and the regulatory attorneys who are involved in ensuring compliance with federal statutes. And so all of those meetings over the course of 15 months were in-person meetings in D.C., which was a great convening of representatives.
So is that group still together, or where are we at in the stage? So you've provided the document. Now it's time for comments back. Does that big group come back together?
Right. So, excuse me. So that work group was concluded. And once we had given a set of draft regulations to OSHA, to NACOSH, and then by giving them to NACOSH, having them referred back through the Secretary of Labor to OSHA, our work was done. And so that work group was concluded. The other important thing to know is that the original draft regulations don't look exactly like they look today. Time has, and research have shown that the philosophy within OSHA has evolved to a more comprehensive recognition of existing standards. And let me give you some examples that are very important. When we were convened in 2015, which is almost 10 years ago, and that's important to note, the position of OSHA was that standards could not be adopted without specifically referencing the year of the adoption. And as a result, OSHA was very reluctant to adopt existing NFPA standards because they all had a termination point. They all most commonly on a 5-year cycle of renewal. In the intervening 9 years, OSHA's position on that has changed, and now they are interested in incorporating by reference, which is called IBR, incorporating by reference NFPA standards, and then turning them into regulations. So that's a pretty dramatic change. It's one that eliminates us having to reinvent the wheel, if you will, because we had really spent a great deal of time writing draft regulations that looked an awful lot like the NFPA standards, but we weren't allowed at that time to incorporate them by reference. Now, OSHA's plan is to do that very thing. So the work group is done. The full-time staff at OSHA are the ones who are responsible for receiving comments and then incorporating proposed changes into what will ultimately become final rules.
Now, I was told, I don't know if this was true or not, but there's in the history of OSHA, there's not been this much energy, this much resources, this many groups, this many people coming together to put a standard together. Is that true?
So certainly this is the most concerted effort to improve firefighter and EMS and technical rescue and emergency services personnel's safety. There's no question about that. And this really does represent the culmination of a huge amount of work on a large number of people's efforts. So, if it were identified as being the most comprehensive in the history of OSHA, I would not be surprised.
Wow. So, well, I appreciate that, Chief. For a lot of information, I guess going back 10 years, a lot of work. You could probably, I'm sure, tell a lot of stories that was being told in those rooms. I'm sure there was a lot of educated people that come together to get us where we're at today. So really, one of the things I want to talk about is how the big changes that are going to affect us. I know the wording is definitely changing. Definitions are being added. We're not fire brigade anymore, 1910-156. We're going to be emergency response teams. We're going to be working emergency response employees. So can you talk a little bit about that, the verbiage?
Yeah, so really important, and if you read the draft regulatory text, it goes to great efforts to define the various groups that are potentially going to be impacted. And it recognizes the difference between a municipal fire department, for example, and a workplace emergency response employer, a WEIR, and a workplace emergency response team, which could be a full-time team or it could be a part-time team where the personnel have other normal duties, but then become emergency responders when an emergency occurs within the private facility. So the really important thing for everyone to understand is that regardless of whether you are a WEIR or a WERT or an emergency services organization, an ESO, the entire regulation is based on a concept known as performance-based standards. In other words, if you work in an industrial setting and you never are going to be involved in a water rescue incident, those components of the regulations will not apply to you. If you are, for example, never going to participate in a trench rescue, those components of the regulations don't apply to you. If you are, however, going to do structural firefighting and you identify that you are going to engage in that activity, then those components of the regulations will apply to you. But it all begins with a self-assessment about what the scope of responsibilities are for the individual entity. Whether it's an industrial setting or a municipal setting, each will have the opportunity to define for themselves what services they're going to provide, scope and breadth. And that's very important, right? Because we might provide hazardous materials operations level response, but not hazardous materials technician level response. And so if we're not in that business, then we're not going to be held to that regulatory standard. So rather than being a prescriptive regulation, which says thou shalt do all these things regardless, the regulations actually focus on trying to be as responsive at the local level as we possibly can be.
Me and Josh has talked about this offline. The assessment you're talking about, Chief, is that the assessment that we're talking about, the vulnerability assessment that is talked about in the standard?
Yep, that's exactly right. So, and you may be familiar with the fact that the National Fallen Firefighters Foundation has had a VAP, vulnerability assessment program tool in place for several years. It's a self-guided tool. There's no cost to it, which is great. Any organization can go online to the foundation's website, access that vulnerability assessment tool, and for themselves conduct their own community risk assessment. And then out of that community risk assessment comes that next step of planning for how you're going to respond to, mitigate, manage those incidents.
Good. Josh, you being in the semiconductor side of things, sticking on the vulnerability assessment, you got anything that any concerns, questions, or anything you can clarify?
No, as Chief Tobia mentioned, that's obviously a very crucial part to this whole process, because that not only helps identify the risks and hazards that we need to be prepared for, but then what do we need to do to get ready for that? And my focus is always on, do we have the right training? Do we have the right equipment? Do we have the right procedures and other documentation in place to execute on those when we need to? And again, as he mentioned, there are going to be components that we're not going to ever hopefully really face, such as swift water rescue. That's just not our bailiwick. So our plan for that would be to call the experts and get their help should that happen to show up at one of our facilities. But no, that's something that I've spent a lot of time reading on in the proposed language.
So pre-plans, vulnerable assessments, are those according to the standard? Are they the same, or are they two separate things now?
No, pre-planning, my read of it is that pre-planning is different than vulnerability assessment, right? So vulnerability assessment is identifying those, the risk and the likelihood of an event occurring within your facility or within your community, and then developing emergency response plans around the vulnerability assessment. So it's risk and risk consequences, right? Risk, what's the likelihood of something happening and what's the consequence of something happening? Then building response plans around that. The pre-planning component is what you and I would commonly talk about in pre-planning for an emergency event, right? So if we know that a particular component of a facility might be at risk for an event, we pre-plan how we might react to that specific event within that facility or within that community. So those are two different things. What also really is fairly universal in the in the proposed regulations is compliance with some type of national incident management system, right? Some recognized incident management structure so that even if you are calling in specialized resources, you're already operating in a standardized, structured way so that cooperating agencies can integrate into your incident and do so fairly seamlessly. There's also an expectation of the creation of a risk management plan. So, things that in reality, things that the industrial side does extremely well is an area that the municipal fire service is probably going to have to catch up on. My experience in cooperating with industrial facilities is that they have immensely detailed risk management plans, and they have very, very, very capable risk managers. That's not something that municipal fire services typically have on staff. Now, all of us are risk managers, but we don't necessarily have that subject matter expertise. So that's an area where the industrial world is actually going to be out in front of us on this topic.
Yeah, and I can tell you the reason why. And Josh, I'm sure you can back this up. Private industry is a for-profit. The industrial side is for-profit. So if there's any breakdown within the system, people may lose their jobs, or the company may not open back up. So all those, process safety, environmental health and safety, all those are coming together. So that's the reason that I think the industrial side's got that down so good, is because we don't want to stop operations because it affects the business, the bottom line. So, hey, we're coming up on a break. When I come back, I want to talk about the NFPA standards that are being added into this, which is a bunch. And then I think that's, to me, that's a big part of this, the economic impact, and then how we're going to work through all these NFPA standards. So when we get back, we'll tackle that topic. Fire weaknesses. Hey, we're back. Discussing our topic 1910-156. Want to jump straight into the NFPA standards, which, in my opinion, on the industrial side, and Josh, you can, I think you agree with me on this. This is the big part of the change to 1910-156, where they're adding in 21, I believe 21 new NFPA standards, and 14 are referenced. Chief, if you don't mind, let's tackle some of those, what we think are the big ones, and how they're going to affect the industrial side and also the volunteer municipal side.
Yeah, sure. Thanks so much. And it really does warrant a careful reading. And the other thing that I do want to talk about is that the IAFC is very serious about ensuring that all comments regarding the proposed regulations are not only captured, but are communicated back to OSHA. And so as we walk through this, I just want to point out that the IFC has retained a law firm to work with them to ensure that all of the sections and divisions and committees in the IFC have an opportunity to weigh in on these proposed regulations and make sure that our voices are heard. So really an important thing. But, let's talk about a couple of those. So, one that I know is always prone to draw a lot of attention is, for example, 1582, which is the medical evaluation standard, the requirement that personnel undergo a medical evaluation on an annual basis to ensure that they are fit to perform the rigors of emergency services within the community or in the workplace. One of the things that OSHA has gone to great lengths to identify is to ensure that there's language in there that is not going to put that responsibility on the emergency responder, but is going to be something that is going to be required to be carried by the employer or the emergency services organization that, supports those emergency responders. So that's certainly an area of concern. I can tell you, in my time in the fire service, we've implemented NFPA 1582 physicals in organizations where there weren't any before. And although there is tremendous concern about the possibility of individuals no longer being permitted to serve as emergency responders, my lived experience in two metro combination fire departments has been that 99.9% of emergency responders are able to either pass the physical outright, or they have a correctable medical condition that allows them to continue to serve their communities. And so while I know that there's a lot of concern about that, I also know that the leading cause of death for all firefighters is cardiovascular incidents within 24 hours of responding to a call. Cancer is, without a doubt, one of the biggest emerging topics in emergency services community. And frankly, mental health is also an area of growing concern. And, we need emergency responders to care as much about their own health as we as leaders do about their health as well. So that's one example. Another example is NFPA 1710 and NFPA 1720, which talks about the formation and deployment of emergency service organizations. One of the things that I know the IAFC is likely going to have concern about is the prescriptive components of those standards that talk about minimum staffing levels. And and also talks about the assembly of an effective response force within a certain amount of time. What I think we want to make sure that we're communicating is that type of formulaic prescriptive regulation doesn't serve well across the myriad tapestry of the United States of America. So we would want the flexibility to have each entity for themselves identify the amount of time that they want to assemble an effective response force, and then meet that standard for themselves, as opposed to meeting all of the components of 1710 or 1720. And I think the OSHA is very open to hearing about specific line items in the body of the standards that warrant careful consideration.
So going back to the 1582, on the industrial side, when you join the fire brigade, then you have to be you go through medical and you get cleared. 1582 is a much bigger. That's a program. So that standard, and so that will definitely be a big one for the industrial side of things, not just being cleared, but just what you named off, the mental health, a program, so to speak, if to get you on the brigade if you can't pass your physical. So those are definitely some big changes. To me, the officer. So for 1910-156, for the industrial leader, they have to be trained above than what a firefighter is. It doesn't go into detail. It doesn't reference any NFPA standards. But being a municipal firefighter, and Josh, I know you know on the for the officer program, that's big. That's a big change to on the industrial side for 1910-156. So I could go through a long list of them, but those are two big ones that jump out. For the standards, Chief, when we're doing our vulnerable assessments, wildland firefighting, if our plants are surrounded with concrete and there's no chance of us ever, have to fight any wildland firefighting, how does an organization address that?
Yeah, it's really very simple. That particular component won't apply because it's not going to be in your vulnerability assessment. So when you're going through your comprehensive vulnerability assessment, and you're in an industrial area where there's literally no wildland urban interface or wildland risk, that component, that standard would simply not apply. That's where their performance-based regulations are so valuable, because it is not a one-size-fits-all, you have to comply with all components. It is define what you're going to provide and then meet those regulations.
Josh, is there any of these standards that on the semiconductor side in your organization that jumps out at you?
Yeah, going back to the medical. So, of course, we are engaged with everything to comply with respiratory protection and doing the medical clearance to do that. Some of the stuff that stood out to me in the proposed language, actually a person can be cleared medically, but they are seeing where that individual may not physically be able to perform the job. So getting into some of that assessment, either pre-employment or on some kind of frequency where a person is evaluated whether they are physically able to perform the duties or tasks related with their job, was something that caught our eye, that I'm working with a consultant on to make sure that we implement appropriately, as again, the physical ability testing that you see in the fire service, we can't just copy that into the private industry, because pulling a hose line might not be something that we do, or ascending a ladder, that kind of thing. So we want to make sure that that's fair to the people that are going to have to go through that. And then, as Dan said, we're good at doing the risk assessments and all of that, but NFPA is a whole new can of worms for us that we're going to have to get familiar with, as we always had our sights set on OSHA compliance, and now we're going to have to, through the IBRs, have to be familiar with NFPA too. So.
One of the really important points that I want to highlight about the NFPA standards is that if you've ever looked at an NFPA standard, there are the chapters that are directly on point, and then there are annexes in the back that are explanatory. OSHA has gone to great lengths to indicate that only the chapters that are on point for the topic are the ones that are the components that are being incorporated by reference. The annexes are not going to be incorporated by reference. That material is oftentimes explanatory, and even when NFPA standards are contemplated to be adopted or referenced in the municipal environment, the annex material is truly and clearly meant to be supporting. It is meant to provide clarification, but the wording in the annex is not part of the actual consensus standard itself. It is an appendix. It is not part of the standard. And OSHA has gone to great lengths to indicate that that's going to be the case for these regulations as well. One of the things that I think it's important is to identify, for people that are listening to this that have a stake in the impact of these regulations, is really look carefully at the NFPA standards and identify language in the standard that is easily supported or that cannot be supported, and then provide very clear explanation to OSHA staff about why that is not a viable component of a regulation to be adopted. Because OSHA truly wants to hear it. They've also gone so far as to publish a series of 40 specific questions that they want guidance and feedback on. The one thing that I think OSHA really recognizes is that they are not the subject matter expert to the extent that the fire and emergency services community are subject matter experts on these topics. And so they're asking us, all of us, to provide feedback and answers to those 40 questions to help craft regulations that are going to do the most important thing, which is reduce preventable line of duty deaths and injuries.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. So to remind us, so there's a lot of NFPA standards, but those standards are going back to your meetings that you had in 2015 or starting in 15. and saying this standard needs to be in this because it is a life safety. It could save someone's life or an injury. So that's, and I don't want to speak for you, but all the standards that are in there and the ones that are referenced, those still go back and you're asking your question, could this be save a line of duty death? Is that correct?
Yeah. The entire focus of this is how do we better ensure the safety of emergency response personnel? And so when we're looking at components of NFPA standards, it is what are the components that are going to have the most positive impact with the least economic impact. Because we know that, even in my municipal fire department, we know that we are not fully compliant with many of the NFPA standards that are being proposed. We know that we're compliant with pieces of them. And so it's important for us to look at what are the most important pieces? How do we ensure compliance? And what does that mean for us down the road economically? And what does it mean for us as an organization?
So, and we could keep talking about this all evening. Josh, I don't want to cut you off on anything. Is there anything that, well, my plan on this is to have a couple of these podcasts as we get closer to the comment day. And by the way, the comment day OSHA gave was May 6th. They moved that to June the 21st. Is that correct?
I believe so, yes.
Okay. So this podcast is going to bring in a lot more questions that we definitely didn't answer here. I would like to talk about, Chief, what the IAFC has broke down our group. We met last week. I think there was 35 people from the IAFC on that call. And the determination was that, hey, we're going to break this up into subcommittees and start breaking it down and giving our comments back to OSHA that way. There's three or four subcommittees. Am I correct?
Yep. Yeah, there's three main sub work groups. One is the impact of volunteer firefighters and emergency service organizations. One is focusing exclusively on the incorporation by reference of NFPA standards. And the third one is the economic impact component of the proposed regulations. And then the IFC has also assigned all 40 questions to specific sections and divisions within the IFC to provide feedback and answers to those questions. So not only are there three work groups that are focusing on the components of the standards or regulations that we're talking about, there's also a commitment to providing feedback on those 40 questions. And then after the IFC assembles all of its comments and submits those in writing, there's then going to be public hearings. So the OSHA is already planning for all of the major fire service entities to come and give live testimony, submit follow-up written testimony, and any additional supporting documentation that they think OSHA should consider as it contemplates these new regulations. So there's going to be ample opportunity for continued engagement.
And I just want to hop on there, Dan, that that's where we're spending a lot of our time. My employer is, we've of course become familiar with the proposed language, but then what are our answers to the questions that might affect us? So we're spending most of our time looking at what questions we think are applicable to us and what our answers would be to those. We honestly, right now, we don't have many comments on the language itself, but I would add for anybody watching or listening that while all comments are going to be looked at and heard, it would go further if you could add a reference to support your position if you are against something in the language, just to help back up what you're recommending. So
we just scratched the surface on this topic today. Subscribe to the 360 Size Up to get more information on this topic as we bring it to you.